Welcome to this session of literary criticism, where we would be looking into the essay The Language of Paradox by Cleanth Brooks. In our previous session, we actually looked into the essay The Hearsay of Paraphrase. Let us now find out what Brooks has to say about paradox. Cleanth Brooks is an influential American new critic, known for his works The Wellwrought Urn, Studies in the Structure of Poetry, written in 1947, and Modern Poetry and the Tradition in 1939. Brooks' main argument in his theory of poetry is that the best way to understand poetry is through the use of ambiguity and paradox. The critic Leach is of the opinion that Brooks has assisted in formulating formalist criticism by emphasizing, I quote, the interior life of a poem, unquote, and advocating the dictum of close reading. Brooks asserts that the language of poetry is different from science. Paradox springs from the poet's language. As Brooks mentions, it is a language in which the connotations play as great part as denotations, unquote. The poet has to devise new ways of expressing his concerns, working within limits, and to achieve this, he has to make up his language. This means that the poet must make conscious effort to convey the precise meaning through the use of poetic language. Words are changeable, and accordingly meaning changes when words are placed in relation to one another. Before we move into the essay, let us find out who were the critics who actually influenced Cleanth Brooks. Brooks became involved with two movements, the Southern Agrarians and the Fugitives, while studying with John Crow Ransom and Robert Penn Warren. The Southern Agrarian Manifesto, named "I'll Take My Stand," influenced his ideas on what good life is and how it should be. Brooks did not object to the traditions of the South, which were conservative. The fugitive movement influenced his approach to criticism. The Fugitives were a group of Southern poets that included John Crow Ransom, Allen Tate, Davidson, and Robert Penn Warren. The group would meet on Saturday evenings to read and discuss poetry written by the members of the group. Intensive reading that concentrated on the form of the poem, its structure, imagery, and rhyme scheme was conducted. This close analysis of the poems perhaps laid a foundation for the new critical movement and helped Brooks to formulate his critical principles. The title, The Wellwrought Urn, comes from the fourth and penultimate stanza of John Donne's The Canonization. I quote the lines, "We can die by it, if not live by love. And if unfit for tombs and hearse our legend be, it will be fit for verse. And if no piece of chronicle we prove, we'll build in sonnets pretty rooms." As well, a well-wrought urn becomes the greatest ashes as half-acre tombs, and by these hymns all shall approve us canonized for love. You have the phrase there, a well-wrought urn. The idea of the autonomy of the literary text is crucial to new criticism. The new critics consider the literary language to be a form of special language, and they insist that while approaching a text, the readers need to focus on the system of relationships operating within the text only and not beyond it. Being different from the other uses of language, the system ensures that the literary artifact is independent. For some of the new critics, the metaphors involved were spatial, suggesting a view of the poem to be an enclosed space or a container. The most enduring of this analysis is Brooks' view of the poem as a well-wrought urn. The literary text is a freestanding entity, an autonomous object containing meanings that are specific to the context provided by the text. Since the literary text is considered to be an autonomous whole, the new critic distrusts paraphrase. To paraphrase a poem is to translate it from one medium to another, and therefore to substitute one kind of meaning with another. This means the textual meaning arises from the textual content and provides the poem's organic system of relationships into a medium in which that system does not operate. A poem's meaning is specific to the system of relationships within that poem. Meaning is not only context specific, but also a part of the overall experience of the poem, for instance, how it sounds and how it appears on the page. Paraphrase necessarily means the loss of this context, the experience of the poem, and hence the import of the complete poem. For the new critics, paraphrase is, as Brooks firmly puts it in the Wellwrought Urn, a hearsay. Let us now move into the 11 chapters included in the Wellwrought Urn. The 11 chapters are: 1. The language of paradox. 2. Naked babe and the cloak of manliness. 3. The light symbolism in La Allegro and Il Penseroso. 4. What does poetry communicate? 5. The case of Miss Arabella Fermor. 6. Gray's Stories Urn. 7. Wordsworth and the paradox of the imagination. 8. Keats' Sylvan Historian, History without footnotes. 9. The motivation of Tennyson's Weeper. 10. Yeats' Great Rooted Blossomer. 11. The hearsay of paraphrase. This is followed by Appendix 1, 2 and 3. Appendix 1 is on criticism, history and critical relativism. Appendix 2 on the problem of belief and the problem of cognition, and Appendix 3 on text of poems. Let us now look into the works analyzed by Cleon Brooks in the Wellwrought Urn. William Shakespeare's Macbeth, John Donne's The Canonization, John Milton's La Allegro and Il Penseroso, Robert Herrick's Corinna's Gone A-Maying, Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock, Thomas Gray's Elegy written in a Country Churchyard, William Wordsworth's Ode, Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood, John Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn, Lord Alfred Tennyson's Tears, Idle Tears, and William Butler Yeats' Among School Children. Let us now move into the essay. The language of paradox is the first essay in the collection of essays in the Wellwrought Urn, Studies in the Structure of Poetry. Traditional theorists consider paradox to be a mere figure of speech, but the critics of the 20th century, especially Cleon Brooks, extend the meaning and application of the term to connote several deviations from common perception. They elevate the term paradox to a position that is helpful in comprehending how its application would encompass a range of surprising meanings that would be constructive for poetry. Brooks commences the essay with the pronouncement, I quote, "Few of us are prepared to accept the statement that the language of poetry is the language of paradox," unquote. He points out to several objections and negative views held by people with regard to the meaning and use of the term paradox. Brooks expresses regret that critics disapprove of assigning value to paradox because they do not consider it as an effective device for writing poetry. Despite prejudice and the disheartening approach towards understanding the value of paradox in poetic language, Brooks asserts that, I quote him, "The language of poetry is the language of paradox." Paradox literally means the assertion of the unification of opposites. However, Brooks assigns a greater function to paradox. According to him, paradox lends a dramatization of experience. A poet's experiences are often diverse, dissonant, crude, common and complex. He can neither present them as a statement nor as an abstraction like a scientist. The poet adopts an indirect method to unify the complexity of human experiences into one whole, to assign the manifestation of total experience. Paradox is an instrument to unify the opposites to form a unique entity. In this way, paradox becomes the language appropriate and inevitable to poetry, says Brooks. A poet cannot escape from its use, because paradox springs from the very nature of poetry, consciously or otherwise. Brooks makes a crucial distinction between the language of science and poetry. A scientist expresses the truth through a language which is quite clear, direct and free from literary devices and paradox, which is a language purged of every trace of paradox. But a poet discovers the truth only in terms of paradox. In order to establish his contention, Brooks analyzes poems very closely and deduces that paradox is one of the common structural properties contained in poetry. He finds that the use of paradox in poems would enrich, enliven and render power to situations that employ the device. This powerful device, therefore, cannot be considered to be cheap ornamentation that performs an artificial function. This justifies Brooks' anger at those who deprive paradox of its naturalness. He says, I quote him again, "Our prejudices force us to regard paradox as intellectual rather than emotional, clever rather than profound, rational rather than divinely irrational." Unquote. All this said, Brooks analyzes paradox in Wordsworth's sonnets and the preface to lyrical ballads. Let's try to find out what Brooks has to say about the use of paradox by Wordsworth. He illustrates examples of the use of paradox from these poems of Wordsworth and compares the works with that of Alexander Pope to justify his statements about paradox. Wordsworth's poetry is characterized by directness, simplicity and unsophistication, and yet the typical Wordsworth sonnet, "It is a beatus evening, calm and free," is based on details. The opening lines of the sonnet read, "It is a beatus evening, calm and free. The holy time is quiet as a nun, breathless with adoration." Wordsworth is in the deep mood of adoration, but the small girl walking along with him is unaware of it. She should in fact keep tune with the holy time and become like the evening, nun-like. She is less reverent than nature itself. In the next stanza, the poet notices, "If thou appear untouched by solemn thought, thy nature is not therefore less divine. Thou liest in Abraham's bosom all the year, and worshipped at the temple's inner shrine, God being with thee when we know it not." Paradox runs through these lines. The innocent girl maintains a secret communion with or sympathy for nature throughout the year. With her innocence, she is closer to God than the poet who is far off the glory of God. She is filled with deep worship for God than the self-conscious poet because of her intimate relationship with nature. She is always consumed with sympathy for nature and not as is the speaker who is in tune with nature only when he is immersed in it. This reminds Brooks of Coleridge's message in The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. "He prayeth best who loveth best all things both great and small." In the sonnet, "It is a beatus evening, calm and free," paradox has another dimension to it. It is quite obvious that the tranquility of the evening denotes worship, even to the dull-witted and the insensitive. The tranquil evening also reveals the religious sentiment of the nun that is external and visible to all. Paradox lies in the fact that the nun's attitude not only shows holiness, but also the external exhibition of holiness, which is in direct contrast to the careless innocence of the girl who cherishes a continual secret prayer for God. After this example, Brooks moves on to analyze how paradox works in Wordsworth's sonnet composed upon Westminster Bridge. The greatness of the poem, says Brooks, does not lie in the noble feelings or in the brilliant images depicted. The power of the poem lies in the poet's capacity to present an incongruous situation. The sonnet contains hackneyed similes and items like towers, ships, domes, theatre and temples, but they do not appear as graphic images. All the objects of nature, places and buildings flickering in the morning light give a foggy impression. The paradoxical situation is ingrained in the usual unattractive, noisy, smoky industrial city of London and the splendour of the morning in the smokeless air. I quote the lines, "Never did sun more beautifully steep in his first splendour, valley, rock or hill." Through these lines, the poet presents a stark contrast between the actual mechanical and dull life of London and the freshness and glory of the morning images, the gliding river and its natural course. The poet is shocked and amazed watching such a paradoxical picture of life in London. Under the semblance of death, it acquires the organic life of nature. Further, the poem ends with a concluding couplet, "Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still." The poet always considered the houses inanimate and dead, but at night the houses would fall asleep. In the morning, what appeared to be asleep would come back to life as if animate. In addition to that, London, the city that teems with life, is also silent and not dead. Brooks explores the central charm of the poem, which is a treatment of paradoxical images and thoughts. Let's now analyze paradox in the Preface to Lyrical Ballads, of course, the second edition of the preface. After examining the paradox in Wordsworth's sonnets, Brooks makes an estimation of Wordsworth's statement in the second edition of the Preface to the Lyrical Ballads that contains paradox. Wordsworth states that his intention is to choose incidents and situations from common life, but they should be colored in such a way that ordinary things would remain in the mind of the reader in an unusual manner. Later, Coleridge classifies this statement that Wordsworth aims at lending, I quote, "the charm of novelty to things of everyday," unquote, and exciting a feeling of the supernatural awe and wonder. The mind, which remains dormant and dull, opens to an avenue of the loveliness and the wonders of the world before us. In other words, it is the purposeful attempt of Wordsworth to formulate his paradoxical attitude that the common was really uncommon, the prosaic was really poetic. The Romantics are primarily concerned with creating wonder and surprise when presenting the familiar world in a new light. All this being said, let us now recapitulate whatever we have done so far. An active member of the new critical movement, Brooks traces the use of paradox as an effective tool in reading poems as well as a method of critical interpretation. By insisting that the poetic language was the language of paradox, Cleon Brooks was expressing his basic concept, refusing to look at things simply and saying what has to be said in a simple manner. This means that Brooks' criticism of poetry is complex. His significant declaration is that paradox is the language appropriate and inevitable to poetry. This means that referential language is imprecise for the specific message that a poet would desire to express. The language of poetry is different from the language of the sciences. The use of referential language is insufficient to bring out the exact meaning of words. On reading Wordsworth's sonnets, Brooks arrives at the conclusion that paradox used in the poems creates multiple meanings, which is the hallmark of this poetic device. The paradox at the end of the poem, "It is a beater's evening, calm and free," implies that the girl worships nature more than the poet because she is consumed with sympathy for nature, albeit she does not seem so. In contrast, the poet is immersed in nature only when he is immersed in admiring nature, which is transitory. On reading Composed upon Westminster Bridge, Brooks asserts that the poet does not view London city to be a mechanical and artificial landscape, but one that is encompassed by nature, or in fact the city is a part of nature. With regard to the use of paradox in the preface to the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads, Brooks mentions that Wordsworth intentionally uses paradox to express the common in an unusual manner. In this way, Wordsworth makes the purposeful attempt to formulate his paradoxical attitude where the commonplace is made colorful and delightful. We have questions for you to answer that will enable you to understand the essay better. Until I meet you next time with further essays and ideas of critics, thank you.